I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I am your hot and sweaty co-host, Matt Bernico. I'm hot and sweaty again because I was outside at Pride afternoon. It was really fun, but it's too hot out there, I gotta tell you.
It's a hot one, and it's only going to get hotter. But we're not talking about climate change for a change here on this podcast. Instead, we're talking about something more exciting, which is the recent electoral victory of Gustavo Petro, the presidential candidate in Colombia, the very first left-wing president in the history of that country. We've brought back a past guest that we've had on the show, Hector Acero Ferrer, who is a colleague of mine at the Institute for Christian Studies. I've known him for a long time. He's a fantastic scholar of liberation theology, always thinking about Colombia and these different kind of theological ways of bringing in concepts like hope and memory to really analyze actual concrete situations. So excited to have Hector to guide us through what this recent victory in Colombia means and what it might also mean kind of theologically and for how we think about the region.
Yeah, for sure. Hector is extremely thoughtful, I think, about the way he answered all of our questions and explained it all. So it was great to hear from him. I'm excited for everyone else out there to listen to it.
Me too. If you can't get enough of this content, you can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. And folks who support us at $2 or more also get access to a really neat Discord community that's there. We've been talking about all kinds of things, current events, books, articles, and so on. Lots of great memes shared in there if you're into that sort of thing. Extremely niche Christian left-wing discourse that's happening. We occasionally do another podcast around current events that we post there when we can get around to it. We should probably get back around to it this summer, but it's called The Lock-In, and you can find all that and more at patreon.com/the Magnificast.
All right, great. Let's go to Hector.
Thanks for joining us on the show, Hector. For a long time, Magnificast listeners, Hector's been on the show a handful of times in the past to talk about liberation theology and Colombia, but this time he's back to talk about the recent electoral victory of Gustavo Petro, the new president of Colombia. All very exciting stuff, but before we get that far, Hector, could you introduce yourself for folks who may not have heard you on this podcast before?
Oh, thank you, Dean and Matt, for inviting me. I'm Hector, so Hector Alfonso Acero Ferrer, that's my full name. Now that I'm speaking about Colombia, I feel I should say my full name as it's supposed to be pronounced. I currently live in Toronto. I'm an adjunct faculty member at Martin Luther University College in Waterloo, and I also work at the Institute for Christian Studies, and I'm also a PhD student there. My research, as Dean mentioned it before, is on liberation theology, particularly looking at ecclesial-based communities, which are kind of the nodal places where liberation theology emerges, and seeing how those allow or inspire some sort of civic engagement. So that's a little bit about me.
Cool. Thanks, Hector. Well, all right. We're talking about Colombia. We're talking about Gustavo Petro. As a person who is from Colombia, how would you tell the story of Colombian politics? I mean, that's like a huge, like a stupidly huge question. It's a big country. A lot of things have happened. It's cool. But I don't know. How would you tell us the story as a person with that background? What are the big movements within it that might help people in North America kind of contextualize the situation in Colombia, but also what Petro's victory means?
Yeah, there are a few ways of getting at this question, but I decided to kind of narrow it down as like an abbreviated history of Colombian leftist politics. But before I go into that, I just want to say that Colombia, and as many of you may have seen in the news, Colombia has never really elected a left-leaning politician as a president. There have been local elections in which left-leaning politicians have won, up to the kind of mayor of Bogota, which is the capital and biggest city in Colombia, but never a nationwide movement that has done what Petro has done this time. So this is huge, but it also says something about Colombian politics, the fact that Colombia has been the only country in Latin America that has never seen the left as a real possibility to govern, like to be governed under. And that says something about who Colombians are, but it also says something about Colombians' role in the geopolitics of the region and how that relates to the United States. And I'll say something about that later. But for now, I just wanted to give you a little run through the history of the Colombian left, because that's really important to understand Petro's victory and Petro's own history as a person and as a member of a larger movement. So the first moment that we see a left coalescing in Colombia as a movement is really between the 30s and 40s. With kind of a movement that is now called liberalism, but it is not liberalism in the way that we understand it now in Colombia. It's just a more radical expression of politics that is trying to break with a lot of the traditional ways of doing politics in Colombia. So that happens in the 30s and 40s, and it ends with the what we call the Magnicide, the murder of presidential candidate Jorge Eliezer Gaitán in April 9th of 1948. That moment is a crucial turning point in Colombian history because it brings the political violence that we know now in Colombia starts in that moment with the murder of Gaitán in downtown Bogota. That gives the fuel to a lot of leftist guerrillas in the country to be formed, both urban and rural. But it also fuels the right-wing conservative movements to also coalesce with armed agents and eventually develop the kind of conflict that we know now and that is somehow addressed with the peace process that we're going to talk about in a moment. That goes on to 20 years of the emergence and development of the leftist guerrillas. There are different movements, and we have known them through different names: the FARC, the ELN, the EPL, and smaller guerrilla movements that we really don't know as we don't know them as a national force, but they are just local movements that kind of fight in their local regions independently from the larger groups that people usually know about. Sorry, that's a very long history, but it really is relevant to understand what is happening now, because it is out of those guerrilla movements that there is a great desire for peace in the country, a peace that includes all the left-leaning political movements, both armed and not armed right now. So we're back in the 60s and 70s. That gets fueled intellectually with the during the 70s and 80s with movements of students that start enrolling in the guerrillas. So the guerrillas started being really a rural movement and eventually become a more urban movement. and that coalesces around a particular group called the M19, the movement of April 19th. So another big April date for us. So we have the first April date, which is April 9th, which is the murder of Jorge Eliezer Gaitán in 1948. And there is April 19th of 1970, which is a presidential election that everybody knows was won by Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, who was a kind of former military leader and dictator in question mark, because we really is not dictator in the way that other dictators were dictators in Latin America. But he wins that election in 1970, and Colombians go to bed that night assuming he won and he's going to rule the country for 4 years, and they wake up with him being ousted and a conservative president in power. So that gives fuel to M19 to emerge, and M19 is the movement that will eventually be Gustavo Petro's home movement. So he becomes a member of that guerrilla movement, and during the 80s, they have a central role in Colombian politics because they achieve an amnesty and a peace agreement with the government in the late 80s. And their membership goes from being militants out in the cities to be politicians. So many of them become members of the House of Representatives, many of them become senators, and it is through that transition that Petro himself becomes a member of the House. So that's the first moment in Petro's own history that he becomes a member of the national political stage. Before that, he was a local leader. He had been a mayor of a small town north of Bogota, but through the amnesty of the M19, he becomes member of the House of Representatives, and he begins his career as a member of really some sort of opposition to every government that happens between that moment in the 80s and now. Sorry, I need to take a little break.
Yeah, of course. No, that's great though. Yeah, it's helpful to get all that context on the table, and obviously it's a really complicated history in a complicated country. Maybe we can jump forward a little bit by just talking about, who's Petro now, and what do you think appealed to the people of Colombia in a unique way? As you said, he's the first leftist president. I remember even talking to you a little bit, as the elections were going on, and at that time, I know when they got to the runoff, you were unsure, to put it lightly, I guess, about his prospects. So what do you think maybe tipped him over the edge, or finally, got him to secure that historic victory?
I think that is a transition that he had as a person, but also the left had as a movement in Colombia. A transition between being an opposition that never saw itself governing to an opposition that will eventually govern. So an opposition that had hope of eventually running the country. And what do I make that difference? Because for the longest time, both as military groups and as political parties, the left saw itself just as a way of keeping some tabs on the government and keeping the government accountable in the margins. But eventually, with the action of Petro, they became a movement that had the hope of really transforming politics in the country, and that goes through like three different moments. So the amnesty with the M19 ended up developing a group called Unión Patriótica, the Patriotic Union, which is a movement that had many of the ex-members of M19 being its leaders, and they were intellectual, but they had also been guerrilla members and had been militant in many different ways, and they were gaining a lot of traction in the late 80s and early 90s. But during the same period, the violence in Colombia increased, and many of them were murdered. There is a really nice quote from Petro, from his running in the election, not this one, but the last one, so 4 years ago, when he said that those who were voting for him were voting for the worst of the possibilities they would have had back in the 80s. So he is the only person really left from that movement. There were hundreds of them that were killed, local leaders and national leaders that were killed because they had a chance of running the country. And a transition needed to happen over the last 35 years, as long as I've been alive, for that movement to eventually become the movement that Petro is really the face of that movement now. And the transition was a transition that involved something that we call citizenship pedagogy, which was led by a figure called Antanas Mockus, who is a supporter of Petro now. We had to go through a process of kind of a new left. So when the left really started winning in local elections, through being the government in small provinces, in the bigger cities of Colombia, like Bogota, like Cali, also in the north, then those members of those parties that eventually coalesced in the left that we know now started seeing what it was like to really govern a place like Colombia, or to govern in a place like Colombia. The compromise that came with it, the difficulty of dealing with international pressures. There is a lot of ambiguity coming from the international community as to what Colombian politics and Colombian democracy should look like. So all of this long story to say, Petro really has gone through all that journey himself. So he has been a guerrilla member, and that has been in all the headlines of all the newspapers around the world. Guerrilla member, former guerrilla member becomes a Colombian president. But between being a guerrilla member and being a president, he's also been a member of the House of Representatives, a Senate member, a mayor of Bogota, and he's been many other things along the way that have taught him what really means on the ground to rule and to govern, to be a leader of Colombia, and also to be a leader of a country in which the left has also harmed a lot of people. And I wouldn't really be responsible or honest if I were to speak now without recognizing that aspect of it. And it is the fact that Petro himself has recognized that earned him the extra votes that he needed to win the election.
That's really interesting. Well, I mean, first of all, I guess, a headline that says former mayor wins presidency is not as exciting as former guerrilla member, but it's helpful contextualization to make sense of the sensationalization of Petro as a figure. That's interesting. I want to ask a big question about the peace process, because that's a huge part of it. But maybe before we get that far, you just mentioned that Petro himself has kind of spoken about the violence that the left has caused. I don't know. How does that work out for him? Can you say a little bit more about that? If not, it's okay. But I'm interested to hear how, I don't know, what does that sound like, or how does that work out for him?
Being connected to not just the left, but the left that was out, like how we call it in Colombia, on the hills, like being a fighter, is one of the greatest liabilities of Petro himself, because especially during the last few years, Colombia has seen a type of violence from the left that wasn't present before. Violence that is happening in the cities, that is connected to drug trafficking, that is connected to kind of terror attacks. I don't like that term because it brings together a lot of things that don't belong in it, but that's how the way it's presented. So that's how people perceive it. So that is a liability for him. So he has had to speak several times about it and what he feels about that. And perhaps there are two ways in which he's addressed that. The first one is by being really a supporter of the peace process itself, saying that we need to, in order to guarantee that the crimes are not going to be treated with impunity, we need to really adhere ourselves to the peace process and what the peace process calls us to do in terms of that special justice system that was created to address what happens after the war in that case. And the second line of action for him has been to have conversations with victims and have conversations with victims of both sides. Go to communities where the guerrilla groups have come in and committed massacres. Go to those small towns in which indigenous groups are both afraid of the left and the right and dialogue with them. So it is that kind of community-based work that he's done that has really earned him the support of those peripheral communities that were affected by really both left and right, but in his case, the left, which would have been the thing that would have caused them to be hesitant to vote for him. So you'll see the change, the shift between the elections 4 years ago and the elections now, where 4 years ago he had parts of the periphery of Colombia on his side, and this time around he has a solid, like all the way around Colombia, all those departments, the provinces, the states that are in the periphery of Colombia are all solidly Petro. Petro won by like a landslide in most of them, like 70-60% of the vote was for him in those areas because he just went and did the work and decided that he really needed to dialogue with the communities and show them that the left could have a different kind of presence for them.
That's so fascinating. What a neat thing. I mean, it's such a hard situation, I guess, but to see that's how he kind of overcame it is pretty fascinating. Well, maybe we can get a little bit more into the peace process then, because that is a big part of the story as well. So, yeah, I mean, one of the major things that was at stake in the election itself was the peace process in Colombia. So can you explain what that process is and how it stalled under Duque?
Yeah, the peace process is one of kind of the greatest moments in Colombian history, in recent Colombian history. Why? Because it came out of nowhere. The president of the time, which was Juan Manuel Santos, had been the defense minister of Álvaro Uribe, and Álvaro Uribe was the president that wanted to win the war. His whole platform was, we need to win the war to make this a democratic and peaceful country. That was exactly what he said, and Santos was right next to him through that process. Then Santos slowly distanced himself from Uribe and becomes the president with the support of Uribe and Uribe's people. But in his own presidency, Santos distanced himself so much from Uribe that he ends up leading this peace process. And the peace process happens in Cuba, which is another major bone of contention for Colombians, because Cuba is connected to radical communism, which is one of the sources of pain for many Colombians. And Santos goes through with the process, and the process ends up in an agreement that is solid, very well crafted agreement with input from many different groups in Colombian politics, but also social movements, grassroots movements. They all had to do with the peace process. Eventually, to legitimize the process, Santos decides that he needs to do a referendum. And the referendum was basically, do you support this peace process? And the majority of Colombians said no. Granted, the majority of Colombians in any of the elections that we've talked about, including the election in which Petro won, is not a significant majority. It's just between the 51 and 55% of the country. At that moment, it was just over half of the country who voted against the peace process. And that evolved in a series of political events that made that over half of the country very angry at the peace process. And they ended up electing the president that decided that the peace process needed to be boycotted, in a sense. And that's Duque, our current president. So he goes into power, and as he starts ruling himself, the country, he decides that he can't fully boycott the peace process, but he is going to stall the process. So he doesn't follow through with many of the areas of the agreements. The special justice system is underway, and he can't really stop that. But even though he doesn't stop that, he stalls so many other aspects of the process so much that social leaders, those who supported the process at the grassroots level, start being murdered across Colombia in the hundreds. So that's happened over the past 4 years. And it is in response to that Petro comes in also in what I was talking about before, in that community-based approach. He goes out to the communities and starts talking to those leaders who are still alive, who are still working for a weird combination between social justice, environmental justice, and the peace agreement. And one of those leaders is Francia Marquez, who is his vice presidential pairing. And that's how he kind of builds his own understanding, his own response to Duque, and that's how he starts supporting the process. We all knew that he was in favor of the process. We all knew that was an important part of his platform, but the significant part of what he does in support of the process is going to the small communities and assuring them that the process was going to be supported not only politically from the downtown, the center of Colombia, but it was going to be supported from those small communities, guaranteeing that social leaders were not going to be killed anymore. And that goes full circle into what we talked about before, that way of him to work both with the factions of the left that are downtown, that are urban, but also with those communities in the outskirts that are hesitant as to which way to go, because they are the first victims of the violence that the peace process promised was going to address.
Yeah, you mentioned also Francia Marquez. So the peace process is certainly, I think, an important symbolic moment, right, for Petro as somebody who was a guerrilla and as you're kind of talking about, has these connections and this really interesting commitment to talking that through with affected communities. But Marquez also seems like such an important symbolic shift as well, right? She's the first Afro-Colombian woman to hold that position. She comes from I think like a working class background rather than an elite background. She's involved in these kind of environmental issues and anti-mining stuff. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about her as well, and how does she factor into Petro's win, her own kind of win, the future for Colombia? I don't know. What do you think about when you think of her in this position?
Thinking about her makes me want to cry a bit, because she is the kind of Colombian woman I grew up with. Not because of her ethnicity, not because she's Afro-Colombian, but because she is through and through a local leader. She is someone who is what is left after violence. many communities in Colombia don't have anything left but the women, the lideresas, the female leaders that decided that they were going to provide some sort of resistance against the paramilitary on the right, against the FARC on the left, against the military in the middle, like in the center of all of that, all those three agents, the women were in the middle of all that process. They were trying to hold on to their children so that the children weren't recruited by any of these groups. And they were trying to imagine a different type of community. And that gets expressed in many different ways. It really is contextual. So in some places, it's a huge emphasis on environmental justice without having the literacy to speak about it, but just intuitively. In some other places, it has to do with just support of memory, trauma, and peace, like that mix of those three things. Just trying to help people work through the trauma of war and imagine a peaceful environment for their children in those local communities. And in some other places, it has some kind of social justice component to it, either equality as conceived in those remote regions, which will have to do with race, or it will have to do with some sort of inclusion of indigenous voices, which happens in the South, or it will have to do with the inclusion of like mother's head of home, which it happens traditionally in the cities. Francia is a mix of many of those, more heavily leaning on the environmental justice side of things, but also mother head of home, but also someone who has defended her own context against the different armed agents, but also a survivor of it all. Many of the lideresas, the female leaders around her, have been murdered. So her story, even though it's very different from Petro's, is also structurally the same. She is the one leader that is still standing in her region. She's the one person that survived it all. And maybe it was just circumstantial, or maybe it was because she was the strongest person, and maybe it's because of the two things coming together. And I think that resonance between the two of them makes Petro and Francia work really well together.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it is really cool. I don't know. I'm in awe again of how interesting this is. I've been reading a bit about Petro himself, and that's been cool, but I've not read about the vice president, and she sounds really rad. Excited to learn more, maybe. Well, you were just mentioning memory and trauma and justice a minute ago, and that seems like a good time to pivot towards maybe a different, thinking about this in a different register. I guess, how have you reflected on this electoral victory theologically? I mean, you're a very smart PhD student. You're working on liberation theology. How does this all sound to you in that register?
That's again another big question, and I will have different answers for it depending on what kind of movement you wanted to describe, but I'll try to get to it through two different angles. The first one is the people's theology itself. I often say when I'm asked that what really is the underlying value of Colombians, I will say that is hope. And I usually, in the context of Colombia, describe hope as both a blessing and a burden. And why a burden? Because Colombians somehow need to be hopeful in spite of it all. We are not allowed to lament. We are not allowed to feel despair. We are not allowed to feel that the situation that we are living in is the worst, or is traumatic, or it should make us cry or suffer. We are always somehow programmed to feel that even after everything that happens to a person, hope is the only possible answer. And that comes from many different angles. It comes from the influence of liberation theology and the particular kind of liberation theology that emerged in Colombia, that had to do a lot with the moment of the gathering of bishops in Colombia, in Medellin in 1968, the birth moment of liberation theology. So we're kind of left with that idea that we are the ushers of that shift in theology, and as such, we need to remain hopeful that that change needs to have results, political results. So that's one pathway of theological reflection by the people in their context, in their communities. But the second path is the theology of the people that has accompanied the emergence of the Pentecostalism meets evangelicalism meets small kind of American churches that have migrated to Colombia in the last 30 years. And that is a theology of the people as much as liberation theology is a theology of the people, and is its own form of progress theology or theology of prosperity or there are many words to describe it on the ground, so I am trying to hold on to those and transliterate those for you, even though they don't mean the same thing that they will mean in the context of the United States. But is the idea that hope is connected to our capacity to make our own situation change. Therefore, if we work hard enough, if we have the proper work ethic that we need to have in order to be people in the world and interact with one another, then God will compensate us with success, with progress, with development. And that is very tricky there, because development is a word that is also very important to the kind of liberation theology that emerges in Colombia. So in many contexts, these two are very close to one another. The theology of the people that is connected to 1968 and the evolution of liberation theology since, and the theology of the people that emerges in the margins of the cities of Colombia and is influenced by a form of Pentecostalism, evangelicalism that has been transplanted from the United States to Colombia. So how do I see all of these political landscape theologically? Is really a victory of the kind of hope that started in 1968, but is also connected to the way in which the Roman Catholic Church is shifting its own presence in Colombia. The Roman Catholic Church in Colombia has been very conservative historically, the same way that politics in Colombia have been very conservative. So unlike everywhere else in Latin America, our church, at least our hierarchy, has remained quite conservative, even in response to a ground level shift to a more a liberation theology influence, a generation of priests and lay leaders. But the hierarchy of the Catholic Church in the last few years have shifted a lot, connected to the papacy of Pope Francis, who is unquestionably a figure that has given a lot of credibility to the peace process, to leaders like Petro, and also to local leaders that are influenced by the left. So theologically, all of these to me means that the understanding of hope that is espoused or that generates some connection between liberation theology and what happens within mainstream churches is what is kind of winning the day, is what people feel more called to, and they feel validated by kind of the international presence of someone like Pope Francis, also advocating for things like that. Pope Francis came to Colombia in 2016 2016 to support the peace process. So we can't ignore the political significance of that, but also the theological significance of Pope Francis' own understanding of what is to be a faithful person in the world and how that impacts Colombians at the ground.
One thing that I always find so useful when I hear you talk about theology, Hector, is that you have this way of putting together the theological side that's more maybe speculative or kind of imaginative or conceptual, and then the real, like, on the ground story of people living lives of faith and what's the kind of emergent theology, trying to really, I guess, not see that sociological maybe way of looking at theology and that conceptual way of looking at it as distinct. And I wonder, as you were sort of thinking about this election, participating in it, watching it, and so on, what kinds of commentary were you seeing from theological communities surrounding the election? Were there liberation theologians kind of intervening in it? Was there a kind of theology maybe bubbling up around it that's unique? Were there any theological trends that you noticed, or that expression of hope? Maybe what do you make of that sort of theological response in Colombia itself?
There are a few things that I think that the two of you and those who are listening will find interesting. The first aspect of it all is that the left in Colombia has been, for the most part, very agnostic or atheist or a combination of the two. I don't know. It's difficult to like put my finger on exactly what they are, but clearly anti church establishment. Therefore, leaders like Petro tend to avoid using God language in their speeches, or say anything like a blessing, or use the word of the term blessing in how they refer to winning or being paired to someone who is the right formula for them, or something like that. But I heard Petro in the last little bit, and this is very recent, last 2 or 3 months, returning to a more kind of theological language, using the word God, using the word blessing. And I don't think I'm the only person noticing that. I think that people are picking up on it, both the electorate, but also the leaders that are around him, and also the vice president formula there. So Francia Marquez, she does use a lot of that theology of the people language. So it is refreshing how she's brought that back into the conversation. So that's one aspect of that. Second one is outside theologians commenting on it a lot. So Leonardo Boff, for example, has been very active, and people in his own circles supporting Petro and speaking about Petro's integrity and Petro's vision and all of that. And that's very, very helpful. It's helpful for people who consider themselves faithful, because they are taught not to dissociate their religious, their faith life from their political life. So when you hear a leader that doesn't necessarily use that language, or that might be against your own faith tradition, then that creates a lot of doubt. But now all of that is being reintegrated in a way that is really helpful, which in turn has allowed the local leaders who were supporting Petro to have that theological turn too, to use the language of faith to speak about what is happening. Providence is not a word we use a lot in Colombia, because the opening up of vistas is so important to liberation theology, but also to other kinds of theology in Colombia. But divine fortuity, I don't know, divine randomness. There is a lot of that kind of language out there, like serendipity, but not just secular serendipity, but serendipity that is influenced by God somehow. There is a lot of that emerging, and that is, I can see that a lot through really social media, how the local leaders are responding to things and including that kind of language in how they speak, but also responding to what the small, if you want to call it ecclesial-based communities, how they are interpreting the gospel and their call right now. So definitely, I think that theology or theological language is making a comeback to politics, but not just through the conservative right-wing side of things, which was what was there before. Colombia is consecrated to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and that is really important to us because that means that in terms of moral theology, we espouse A, B, C, and D. They had it very clear that they were on the side of the right theology and the right religious understanding. But now their situation is getting more complicated because there are sections of the church, the Catholic Church, that are supporting Petro because there are significant religious leaders that were leaders during the peace process who are supporting Petro, but also because there is a comeback of that theological language in how they speak, so people don't feel separated from it when they are connecting their own faith life to the political life.
That's such a cool thing to hear about. As, Petro is sort of like a popular theologian for a minute or something. A very different vibe than the way that works out in the United States, and I mean probably in Canada too, but I don't know about that. Well, anyways, it's really cool. Love to hear it. The theology part is really fascinating. Okay, but maybe let's get down to brass tacks about this guy. He's the first sort of left president of Colombia, and that's really fascinating and cool. But I guess I've read a lot about sort of the reforms that he's interested in making, especially around sort of like social programs and I don't know, drug cartels and things like that. Lots of things on the table, right? Lots of things to reform. In doing that work, though, I guess what do you think will be the biggest challenges that he'll face when it comes to actually enacting some of these policies? I mean, you mentioned that there's all these sort of like areas in the periphery of Colombia that voted for him, but I imagine there are still some pretty significant, detractors.
Yeah. I'll start my answer to that question by pointing to an expression that has emerged in the last week, and this is really significant in all circles. So social media, any conversation you had with people, they'll tell you, "What about the other half of Colombia?" We've never spoken about Colombia in terms of house because we've been a lot more divided than in house, and that's part of why the left never went to power before. But now it seems like Colombia has two halves, and one half, I'm gonna quote what I just heard in the news this morning, voted not for something else, but against Petro. And that twist is really important in all this analysis. The fact that the coalition of forces that supported the candidate that lost the second round of elections coalesce around their anonymity of Petro, their anxiety about Petro going into power. So reconciling with them has become a major theme, and to the point that Petro is now going to meet with Álvaro Uribe, really the figure, the ghost of the Colombian past there. So that figure that has been ruling Colombia behind the veil for the last 20 years at least. So they are going to meet, and that's something that I never thought was going to be possible. They're going to meet and have a dialogue, which will have its own problems, but I don't want to anticipate anything in that direction. I just want to say, dealing with the half of Colombians, or the half Colombia, as the media puts it, that's the first challenge. Second challenge, and this is something that has many types of problems connected to it, is Venezuela. How Venezuela does and how Maduro does internally is very significant, not just for Petro, but for Petro's own capacity of action in Colombia. Just if you start with the physical, concrete realities, Colombia has now around 2 million Venezuelan refugees, and refugees come with their own stories. Refugees come with the stories of terror from their land or of origin. So those stories are the stories that are informing Colombians about what happens in Venezuela and why. Those are the stories to which Petro needs to respond. I'm going to leave it there. Now, there is another aspect of the complexity of what Petro needs to deal with, and is I mentioned this once already, the ambiguity of the international pressure or presence in Colombia. And I'll give you one example because I'm in Canada, and that's something relevant to me as an individual, but also relevant to Colombia as a whole. Canada has two ways of influencing Colombia. Influence number one, wanting Colombia to be a democratic country where people are free to choose whoever they want as president and yada, yada, yada. Influence number two, mining. And mining in Colombia is connected to paramilitary groups. So it is connected to right-wing control of territories. So Canada, de facto, is influencing Colombia in two opposite ways. By promoting the right, but in this case, by promoting also the left, because they support the election of Petro. And Petro is the person that is going to have to negotiate that. Is going to have to negotiate the fact that if he wants Canadian mining to be controlled, then it means that Colombians are going to lose jobs in those regions, and he's not going to have any way to replace those jobs with anything right away. So that needs to be a longer term addressing of that problem. But at the same time, he needs to deal politically with the country of Canada and what that represents. And that's one of the most benign relationships that Colombia has with the international community. The relationship with the United States is a lot more difficult than that, because US companies are all over the Colombia. They have been allowed to run just rampant, to destroy the environment, and yet you now have government in the United States that says that climate change is a reality and that it needs to be somehow controlled. So who do we listen to? And then the burden of dealing with that is not on the countries that are putting pressure on us, but it's on us. Our very fragile democracy that almost depends on two people now, because Petro and Francia are the ones that are going to have to deal with that against so many internal pressures already. Now, the last big concern or big challenge for Petro is local communities. And again, another area in which the right has been very effective in the past. Sorry to keep drilling on this, but Álvaro Uribe had a great capacity to be present everywhere. When he was president, he will fly himself into every little corner of the country, and we have a TV channel that had him going to all these local councils, and he was present, and people liked him not because of what he was doing, but because he was present. Petro has the same challenge of remaining present for people, of having the amount of presence he's had during the campaign throughout his mandate. And that's very difficult to do in a place like Colombia, because, as I already mentioned, he's going to have to deal with many other pressures, both from the political elite in Colombia, but also from the international community. So all of that are the challenges that he's facing. My hope, I don't want to leave that answer in despair. I want to leave that answer in hope, is that Petro is really surrounding himself with very capable people, both at the level of kind of political hierarchy, but also at the ground level. He is acknowledging those local figures that are supporting him throughout the campaign. So I think that maintaining those connections is going to be the way for Petro to be able to enact some of that transformation immediately in the margins, and then come back to the center slowly.
That is really interesting, and I think a helpful way of maybe looking at some of the limitations of Petro's victory or the cross pressures that he's going to have to deal with. Really useful to have that context. Maybe as a final question as we sign off at the top of the hour here, or the bottom of the hour. In the United States and elsewhere too, there's been a lot of hand-wringing over the state of democracy in Latin America, as they put it anyway. So as one example, the cover of the most recent issue of The Economist was kind of getting circulated on the internet. It was titled Democracy in Decay, with a picture of Central and South America beneath it. And, the subtext is because there are all these left-wing governments being elected. And I wonder what you make of the Petro and Marquez victory in Colombia, but also these other victories, in Peru, the return of the MAS in Bolivia, the continued struggles in Venezuela. It's looking like Lula will probably take Brazil in the next election. The pink tide, I guess, is rising again. We'll see what happens. You've been talking a lot about hope and also about challenges. What do you think, kind of considering that region and its sort of signals maybe in our kind of shifting geopolitical order? How do we kind of reflect and make sense of that as Christians on the left?
I'd like to preface my answer to your question by saying I believe that Petro's election in Colombia is actually the first sign that we've had in many, many years in Latin America that democracy in that region is still alive. Why? Because for a very long time, not just because of the elections that have happened recently in the region, like the Duque election in Colombia or the Bolsonaro election in Brazil or the election in Ecuador too, so all of that, but because Colombia was the one place that was really hard to crack in terms of getting the political elite, which was connected to those families that own the country, which is connected to the families that own the church, which is connected to the families that were at some point given the land by the Spaniards. It was the one place where that cycle had not been broken. Violence was always able to silence dissent voices, was always able to kill enough people to maintain only one side of the democratic expression of the country alive. So if this is possible, it means that something is right and democracy is still alive there and we can fight for it. But going back to your question about the influence and the perception and the optics around all of this in Latin America. And I'll go back to a story. I'm sorry for dealing with these questions, which are more kind of abstract with stories, but that's the way I approach things. The political party that saw the transformation of Petro into the politician that he is now is called Polo Democrático, the Democratic Pole. And that party was also the home base of many of the local politicians from the left that became mayors of Bogota, governors of different provinces, senators, House representatives, etc. At the same time, the party that was led by many years by Álvaro Uribe was called the Centro Democrático, the Democratic Center. It's not a coincidence that democratic is integral to both names. Why? Because it is two understandings of democracy that are competing within the country. One, the one that says that democracy is only achievable after the economic issues and are resolved and the war is won and all of that. And the other one that says that in order to solve all of our issues, we need to first allow for a truly democratic process. Those visions of democracy are the visions of democracy we've inherited from the world. The vision of democracy that the Centro Democrático espouses is almost verbatim the vision of democracy that we were told by Clinton and Bush. And the version of democracy that the Polo Democrático espouses is the version of democracy that, for the most part, we've inherited from people coming back from the European Union. So they are imported. They are not local. They competed for a long time, and I believe that for the first time, local movements are developing their own understandings of democracy. So what democracy should look like in your community that is completely fractured, that has been fighting within itself for so long, that is in decline, that has no anymore like young people because they all died in war, because all of that. So that is the kind of democracy that really I see in the face of someone like Francia Marquez. Her understanding of how political dialogue should happen at the local level is her own understanding of democracy. So it might not be the kind of democracy that we inherited from the States, or the understanding of democracy we inherited from the States. It might not be the understanding of democracy that we get from the continental tradition and Europe and everything that the first kind of left movement brought to us, but it is nonetheless democracy. So is it dying? No. Is it in life support? Yes, but it's in life support after being in a full coma. So we are actually waking up as opposed to dying.
You were mentioning how hope is such an important underlying issue or idea in Colombia, and I guess maybe it shines through with that way of thinking too, right? That there's this recounting of democracy, or it's coming back, and the hope is that this is sort of the start of something new and interesting.
Yeah, it is. It is really a hopeful move, and is connected to the understanding of hope that comes from the margins too. That hope against all odds. That is again burden and gift, but it is usually embodied and sustained and informed by the life of the small communities that are at the margin of the country. So the margins of the country. So it would be indigenous groups, Afro-Colombian groups, young groups of students who are informing that new way of looking at the democratic process in Colombia.
Well, Hector, it's been really great to have you back on the show, talking to us a little bit about this situation and talking us through it. It's been a long time since we had a guest on the podcast, and I feel really lucky that we were able to bring you back to encourage us to talk to some other folks. And we look forward to talking to you more. I'm sure this won't be the last time that we want to check in with you and hear about this process and how it's going. So thanks for joining us, spending so much time researching and thinking with us, and we'll maybe seize on those expressions of hope for new democracy in the region.
Thank you both for inviting me and for letting me think through all of these with you, because I haven't had the chance to really think through this all. I've been just so happy that there is a moment of hope for us Colombians, and I think for the world.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, again, you can find us on patreon.com/themagnificast. You can find us on the internet. We've got a Twitter account. That's probably the only thing we check anymore these days, if we're being honest. Our music is by Maria Armstrong, and our outro is by the Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early.